The air in the undersector always tasted of rust and damp ozone, a flavor Kalen had learned to associate with a fragile kind of safety. It was a taste of being unseen, of being a ghost in the machine of the citadel that loomed miles above, a spire of sterile silver piercing a sky perpetually veiled in chemical haze. Here, in the warren of corroded pipes and dripping archways, scent was a currency of survival. His own was a liability, a beacon he kept smothered beneath a crude, stinging patch on his neck, a chemical burn that was a constant, dull reminder of what he was. An Omega, unsanctioned, feral, in the Citadel's cold lexicon. The patch leached a smell of bitter almonds and sterilizing agents into the air around him, a scent designed to say nothing, to be a void where a story should be. He was not a person. He was a blank space, a carefully curated absence. He moved through the narrow passages, his worn synth leather boots making no sound on the grated metal flooring. Silence was another form of currency. He kept his head down, his gaze fixed on the slick, dark ground, tracing the path of a slow, iridescent drip of chemical runoff. The walls hummed with the distant, monolithic pulse of the citadel's life support, a heartbeat he felt in his bones, a constant, oppressive rhythm that defined the edges of his world. He was returning from a trade, a small parcel of salvaged energy cells tucked into the lining of his jacket in exchange for a week's worth of nutrient paste and 2 fresh inhibitor patches. The transaction had been tense, a silent exchange in a forgotten maintenance tunnel, the other scavenger's eyes darting with the same hunted paranoia that lived permanently behind Kalen's own ribs. Fear was the only truly shared emotion in the undersector. It was a tangible thing, a low-frequency hum that vibrated just beneath the citadel's mechanical thrum. Sometimes, if he let his focus slip, he could feel the edges of it, the sharp, jagged terror of 100 other souls hiding in the darkness. It was a sickness, this feeling, an empathic contagion he had no name for, only a deep, instinctual dread of its touch. It came in waves, a sensory tide of panic, grief, and rage that threatened to drown his own carefully constructed emptiness. So he kept his walls up, a fortress of mental silence built brick by agonizing brick. He focused on the physical, the cold metal of the railing under his gloved hand, the precise weight of the energy cells against his side, the rhythmic ache of the inhibitor patch. He was a body. He was a collection of sensations. He was not a receiver for the world's screaming. The air shifted. It was a subtle change, a drop in temperature, a sudden deadening of the ambient noise. The distant drip, drip, drip of water ceased. The hum of the citadel's systems seemed to recede, leaving a vacuum of pure, unnerving silence. Kalen froze, his hand tightening on the railing. Every nerve ending screamed. This was wrong. This was the silence of a predator, the stillness before the strike. He flattened himself against a corroded support pillar, peering into the oppressive gloom. And then he saw them. 2 figures, clad in the stark, shadow-black armor of the Citadel's enforcers. They moved with an unnatural grace, their movements economical and utterly silent, their helmets smooth, mirrored surfaces that reflected the grime and decay of the undersector with perfect, sterile clarity. They were alien here, intrusions of absolute order into a world defined by chaos. They did not belong. They were here to purge. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the dam of his control. A tremor started in his hands. He could feel their focus, a psychic weight pressing in on him, cold and analytical. They were sweeping the area, their helmet sensors passing the environment for heat signatures, for biomarkers, for the ghost of an unsanctioned scent. He pressed himself harder against the pillar, trying to make himself smaller, trying to will his own heartbeat into silence. The bitter almond of his inhibitor patch suddenly felt flimsy, a paper shield against a storm. He could almost feel it, the whisper of his true scent, rain-soaked earth, wild herbs, a hint of ozone from a distant storm, trying to break free. It was the scent of everything the Citadel had tried to eradicate. Nature, chaos, life. For a moment, a flicker of someone else's terror brushed against his mind. The scavenger from the trade, cornered 2 levels down. A flash of blinding light, a choked-off scream. Then, nothing. The empathic echo vanished, snuffed out like a candle flame. They were efficient. They were thorough. Kalen knew he had seconds. He broke from the pillar and ran, his boots finally slapping against the metal, the sound an explosion in the dead air. He didn't run towards his hidden alcove, his small, pathetic nest. That would be the first place they would look. He ran deeper, into the labyrinth, into the forgotten and condemned sections, where the architecture itself was failing. He vaulted a collapsed walkway, landing with a jarring impact that sent a spike of pain up his leg. He ignored it. Pain was a focus. Pain was real. He scrambled through a narrow gap in a wall, the rough edges of torn metal snagging his jacket. Behind him, there was no sound of pursuit, but he could feel them. They were flowing through the darkness like mercury, relentless, inevitable. He could feel their cold, dispassionate intent, a purpose as clean and sharp as a scalpel. He was not a person to them. He was a biological error, a variable to be corrected. The air grew thick with dust and the smell of decay. He was in the old conduits, a section that had been sealed off for a cycle or more. The Citadel's pulse was fainter here, a distant murmur. He risked a glance back. A single red light glowed in the darkness, the optical sensor of an enforcer, unwavering, unblinking. It was gaining. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning, the chemical sting of the patch on his neck flaring with every ragged breath. He rounded a corner and his heart seized. A dead end. A massive, sealed bulkhead, its surface slick with grime. Trapped. He spun around, pressing his back to the cold, unyielding metal. He would not scream. He would not beg. He would give them nothing. The 2 enforcers emerged from the gloom, their black armor seeming to drink the faint light. They stopped 10 feet away, their mirrored helmets giving him back a distorted, terrified reflection of himself. He saw a thin, pale figure, eyes wide with a defiance that felt like a lie. He saw the faint, puckered scar that traced the line of his jaw, a memento from the last time the Citadel had tried to correct him. One of them raised a hand, palm open. A low hum filled the air, and Kalen felt a pressure build against his skull, a crushing weight that made the world tilt. His empathic shields, his carefully constructed walls, began to crack. Whispers of the enforcer's thoughts bled through, not emotions, but pure data. Target acquired. Biosignature confirmed. Omega unsanctioned. Empathic potential. Class 4. Volatile. The clinical terms were like blows, stripping him of his name, his history, his self. He was just a set of classifications, a problem. He grit his teeth, fighting the psychic pressure, a hot spike of anger cutting through the fear. He was not a problem. He was not a variable. The pressure intensified. His vision swam. The rusted walls seemed to breathe, to pulse with the rhythm of his own frantic heartbeat. He felt a trickle of warmth from his nose. His knees buckled, and he slid down the bulkhead, the rough surface scraping his back. The last thing he saw before the world went black was his own fractured reflection in the helmet of the enforcer, his eyes wide with a terror he had refused to voice, a silent scream swallowed by the indifferent dark. The world dissolved into a wash of static and the cold, clean finality of capture. He woke to silence. Not the layered, living silence of the undersector, but an absolute, manufactured void of sound that pressed in on his ears. He was lying on a surface that was cool and unyielding, his body aching with a deep, resonant thrum from the stun charge. He blinked, and the light was a physical blow, a pure, shadowless white that emanated from the ceiling, the walls, the floor. There were no corners in the room, only smooth, seamless curves. It felt like being inside a bleached and hollowed-out bone. His clothes were gone, replaced by a thin, grey, sleeveless tunic and trousers made of a soft, sterile fabric. The inhibitor patch was gone. He reached for his neck, his fingers tracing the raw, irritated skin where it had been. Its absence was a new kind of nakedness, a terrifying vulnerability. He could feel his own scent beginning to bloom in the sterile air, faint at first, then stronger, a smell of earth and rain he hadn't experienced in years. It felt like a betrayal. He curled in on himself, trying to contain it, to hold it back. The air filtration system kicked in with a soft, almost inaudible hiss, and he could smell his own essence being drawn away, analyzed, catalogued. A section of the far wall became transparent, shifting from opaque white to perfect, clear crystal. Beyond it was another room, vast and dark, dominated by a single elevated chair, a throne of polished black obsidian. A figure sat there, motionless, a silhouette against a distant, dimly lit wall. Kalen could feel the weight of his gaze, a pressure that was nothing like the enforcer's psychic assault. This was different. It was ancient and calm and absolute. It was the pressure of gravity, an elemental force that held stars in their courses. He knew, with a certainty that froze the marrow in his bones, who he was looking at. Sovereign Reese, the Alpha King, the architect of this sterile world. He had only ever seen him in filtered propaganda casts, a face sculpted from ice and ideology. His voice, a calm, measured baritone that spoke of order, stability, and genetic purity. To see him in person was to understand that the broadcasts were a pale imitation of the truth. His presence was a physical force, a quiet storm that warped the very fabric of the room. Kalen felt an instinct he had suppressed for a decade rise in his throat, a primal Omega instinct to submit, to bare his neck, to make himself small. He crushed it down with a surge of bitter defiance. He was not an animal. He would not kneel. The transparent wall dissolved, the air between the two rooms shimmering for a moment before vanishing completely. He was in the throne room now, or some cold imitation of it. The floor beneath him was the same polished black as the throne. It reflected the perfect white light of his cell, making it seem as if he were standing on a frozen lake under a sterile sun. Two enforcers stood at the edge of the light, silent sentinels. Reese remained on his throne, his posture relaxed, yet radiating an intensity that was almost unbearable. He was dressed in a simple, high-collared black tunic that seemed to absorb the light around him. His hair was the color of spun silver, and his face, when he finally leaned forward into the faint light, was exactly as the broadcast had shown, unnervingly perfect, sculpted and utterly devoid of emotion. His eyes, Kalen saw, were the color of a winter sky, a pale, piercing gray that seemed to see not just him, but the fractured, terrified mess of his empathic senses. Subject 734, Reese said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the cavernous space, each syllable precise and cold. Designation, Kalen. He said the name as if it were a data point, another classification to be filed away. Kalen said nothing. His jaw was clenched so tight it ached. He met the sovereign's gaze, pouring every ounce of his hatred and fear into the lock of their eyes. He would not be a subject. He would not be a number. Reese tilted his head, a gesture of mild scientific curiosity. Your biological and psychic markers are anomalous, a significant deviation from the established Omega genotype. He spoke as if Kalen were a curious insect pinned to a board. The strength of your scent, even after years of crude chemical suppression, is remarkable. The empathic volatility, however, is a threat to systemic stability. An enforcer moved forward, unlocking the heavy magnetic manacles from Kalen's ankles, only to replace them with finer, more elegant restraints of gleaming silver that were connected by a short chain. Then they did the same to his wrists. The metal was cold against his skin, colder than the air, colder than the floor. They were not the brutal, heavy iron of the undersector cells. They were instruments of precision, designed not just to restrain, but to humiliate. They made his every small movement a soft, metallic whisper. The enforcer stepped back, and Kalen was left standing before the throne, chained, exposed, his unsuppressed scent filling the air, a wild, organic perfume in a world of sterile polymers and recycled oxygen. He felt Reese's attention focus on it, on him. The Alpha King's nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. His scent, in turn, began to bleed into the air. It was not the aggressive, dominating musk Kalen had been taught to fear from alphas. It was clean, cold, and complex, the smell of ozone after a lightning strike, of cold stone from the heart of a mountain, of something ancient and unyielding. It didn't challenge Kalen's scent. It simply enveloped it. It was a statement of fact, not a threat. It said, "This space is mine. Everything in it is mine." Reese rose from his throne. He moved with the same silent, fluid grace as his enforcers, but where their movements were robotic, his were predatory. He descended the few steps to the floor and stopped just before him, so close Kalen could see the faint silver threads in his dark eyebrows. The proximity was overwhelming. The sovereign's scent was a physical presence, a weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. It was calming and terrifying all at once, a paradox that scrambled Kalen's senses. He could feel the immense, disciplined power Reese held in check, a supernova contained within a vessel of ice. The Alpha King reached out, his long, pale fingers gently touching the puckered scar on Kalen's jaw. The touch was not violent, not even possessive. It was inquisitive, the touch of a researcher examining a specimen. But at the point of contact, a jolt, sharp and electric, shot through Kalen. It was not just skin on skin. He felt a fleeting, dizzying impression of Reese's mind, a vast, ordered, and profoundly lonely space. A landscape of crystalline structures and silent, empty corridors. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving Kalen breathless and shaken. Reese's grey eyes sharpened, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. He had felt it too. The connection. He leaned closer, his cool breath ghosting across Kalen's ear. The chains on his wrists chimed softly as he flinched. Reese's voice was a low, resonant whisper that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in his skull, a sound that was both intimate and terrifyingly absolute. "You are an anomaly, Subject 734, he murmured, the words a stark contrast to the almost tender proximity. "A fascinating, dangerous variable." He paused, and Kalen felt the full, undivided weight of the Alpha King's will settle upon him, a brand of psychic and pheromonal pressure that left no room for defiance, no room for anything but the crushing reality of his situation. "You're mine." It was not a lover's promise or a conqueror's boast. It was a simple, clinical statement of ownership, a scientist claiming his discovery, a king claiming his property. The words echoed in the sterile silence, sealing Kalen's fate more completely than any chain or prison wall ever could. He was no longer a ghost in the machine. He was a cog, seized and pulled into its cold, relentless heart. The cell, his new world, was a symphony in white. White walls, white floor, a white recessed pallet for sleeping, a white table that emerged from the wall at his touch. Even the air scrubbed clean of any scent but his own, and the faint antiseptic tang of the filtration system felt white. It was a place designed to erase identity, to strip away the grime and chaos of the undersector and leave only the raw material of the subject. He was the only point of color, of life in the sterile environment, a flaw in the perfection. For the first 2 cycles, he was left entirely alone. The silence was the worst part. In the undersector, there had always been noise, the drip of water, the groan of metal, the distant shouts of other scavengers. Here the silence was a weapon. It forced him inward into the labyrinth of his own mind, a place he had spent years trying to avoid. Memories, sharp and unwanted, began to surface. The warmth of his mother's hand, the taste of real bread baked in a makeshift oven, the sound of laughter echoing in a communal space that had long since been turned to ash and rubble. These ghosts were more terrifying than any enforcer. He paced the confines of his cell, the soft fabric of his uniform whispering against his skin, the memory of the silver chains a phantom weight on his wrists. He was not chained here, but the confinement was more absolute. He was an organism in a petri dish, and the entire citadel was the microscope. He could feel the observation, not a direct psychic probe, but a constant, low-level monitoring. Sensors in the walls tracked his heart rate, his respiration, his hormonal fluctuations. They were mapping him, reducing him to a series of data streams. He tried to meditate, to find the quiet center he had cultivated in the darkness below, but the oppressive sterility of the cell made it impossible. The white light was constant, erasing the passage of time. There was no day, no night, only an eternal, shadowless present. He began to feel his senses dull, his connection to his own body fraying. This, he realized, was the point. It was a sensory deprivation chamber designed to break down his resistance, to make him pliable, to unmoor him from himself. He was not a person being imprisoned. He was a dataset being isolated for analysis. On the 3rd cycle, the tests began. A panel in the wall would slide open, and a robotic arm would extend, offering him a tray with a small grey cube of nutrient paste and a beaker of water. Sometimes the water would be laced with something. He could taste the faint metallic tang. One compound made his thoughts feel slow and syrupy. Another sharpened his senses to an excruciating degree, making the hum of the light fixtures feel like a physical blow. They were testing his neurological responses, his tolerance thresholds. He refused to eat or drink. It was a small, pathetic rebellion, but it was his. After 20 hours, the robotic arm would retract, and a fine, nutrient-rich mist would fill the cell, absorbed through his skin and lungs. They had anticipated his defiance. They had a contingency for it. His body was not his own to control. His small act of resistance was just another data point for them to record. Subject exhibits predictable patterns of non-compliance. Override initiated. The worst were the empathic tests. A section of the wall would turn into a screen, displaying images designed to provoke an emotional response. A sun-drenched field of wild flowers, a starving child with hollow eyes, a fractal pattern that pulsed with a nauseating rhythm. As he watched, he could feel invisible instruments probing his mind, measuring the spikes and troughs of his empathic field. They wanted to see how it worked. They wanted to quantify it, to understand its mechanics. He fought back. He focused on the memory of the fire, the day his world ended. He dredged up the rage, the grief, the terror, and projected it outward, a wave of pure, chaotic emotion aimed at his unseen observers. He felt a flicker of feedback, a moment of distorted static from the monitoring system, a psychic recoil. Then, a dampening field would activate, a heavy blanket of psychic pressure that smothered his abilities, leaving him feeling hollowed out and exhausted. They were learning. They were adapting to his defenses. They were turning his own mind into a weapon against him. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a weapon they were trying to disassemble, to see how it was made. He dreamed of running. He dreamed of the tangled, familiar darkness of the undersector, of the feeling of rain on his face. In his dreams, he was free. But the dreams always ended the same way. He would round a corner and find himself facing a wall of pure, seamless white. The world would dissolve, and he would wake up in the cell, his heart pounding, the sterile white light burning his eyes. The line between waking and sleeping began to blur. The cell was the only reality. The memories of freedom felt like fantasies, like stories he had once read about someone else. The system was working. He was being erased. He started talking to himself, whispering the names of the people he had lost, just to hear a voice, just to prove he still existed. Mara, he would whisper to the white walls. Leo, Anya. The names were anchors in a sea of nothingness. They were proof that he had come from somewhere, that he had been loved, that he was more than Subject 734. One cycle, after a particularly grueling empathic test that had left him trembling and nauseous, the door to his cell slid open. It was the first time it had ever opened. He scrambled to his feet, pressing himself against the far wall, his body tensing for a fight. It wasn't an enforcer. It was Sovereign Reese. He stood in the doorway, a stark figure of black against the blinding white, his presence instantly shrinking the already small room. He held a data slate in one hand, his grey eyes sweeping over Kalen, his expression unreadable, analytical. "Your resistance is illogical," Reese stated, his voice calm and even. "It serves no purpose other than to prolong the diagnostic process." He took a step into the cell. Kalen flinched, a low growl rumbling in his chest, an instinctual sound he hadn't made since he was a child. Reese paused, his gaze fixed on Kalen. "That is the anomaly," he said, more to himself than to Kalen. "The persistence of feral instinct despite environmental conditioning. The data from sanctioned Omegas shows complete instinctual sublimation within 2 cycles of integration." He was comparing him to them. The thought was so repulsive, It cut through Kalen's fear. The sanctioned Omegas were bred in labs, raised in sterile creches, their spirits broken and their instincts chemically neutered before they were paired with alphas for breeding. They were beautiful, docile shells. "I am not one of your pets," Kalen snarled, the words tasting like blood and freedom in his mouth. For the first time, a flicker of something that might have been surprise registered in Reese's eyes. He seemed to genuinely consider Kalen's words. "No," he said slowly, his gaze intense. "You are not. Their empathic fields are silent. Yours is a storm. Even when suppressed, it radiates a chaotic energy that interferes with our local sensor grids." He took another step closer, holding up the data slate. A complex waveform flickered across its screen. "This is you," Reese said. "This is the shape of your defiance." The clinical detachment was more infuriating than any overt cruelty. He was translating Kalen's soul into a graph. Kalen lunged. It was a stupid, hopeless gesture, driven by pure, unthinking rage. He didn't even make it 2 steps before an unseen force slammed into him, throwing him back against the wall. His head connected with the hard surface with a sickening crack, and the white room dissolved into a field of black, glittering stars. As his consciousness faded, the last thing he heard was Reese's voice, as calm and curious as ever. "Fascinating. The kinetic energy spike corresponds precisely with the emotional outburst. The correlation is almost perfect." When he came to, a woman was leaning over him. She wore the simple grey uniform of a beta-class medic, her face framed by short, dark hair, her expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. But her eyes, a warm, deep brown, held a flicker of something else, sympathy. It was so unexpected, so alien in this place, that Kalen recoiled. The woman held up her hands in a placating gesture. "Easy," she said, her voice soft. "You have a concussion. The Sovereign requested I attend to you." She spoke the Sovereign's title with a formal flatness that felt practiced. She gently probed the back of his head. Her touch was professional, but not cold. There was a warmth to it, a human connection that felt as shocking as an electric current after days of isolation and mechanical prodding. "My name is Elara," she said, her eyes meeting his. She offered him a small white tablet and a beaker of water. "For the pain." He stared at the tablet, his mind racing. Was this another test, another chemical to alter his perceptions? Elara seemed to understand his hesitation. "It's just a standard analgesic," she said quietly. "Nothing more. I coded it myself." The unspoken message was clear. "You can trust this. You can trust me." He took the tablet and swallowed it with the water. The medic's presence was a crack in the sterile facade of the citadel. She was a sign that somewhere, beneath the layers of order and control, there were still people. Elara worked in silence for a few moments, cleaning the small cut on his scalp, her movements efficient and gentle. The silence was different with her in the room. It was no longer a void, but a shared space. "Why?" Kalen finally croaked, his throat raw. "Why are you helping me?" Elara didn't look up from her work. "The Sovereign's directives are to ensure the subject remains healthy for the duration of the analysis," she said, the formal language a stark contrast to the quiet intimacy of the moment. "I am following my directives." But her eyes told a different story. When she finally met his gaze again, the professional mask slipped for just a second. "Not everything in the Citadel is made of steel and protocol," she whispered, so low he could barely hear it. "Some of us still remember what it is to feel." With that, She finished her work, packed her medical kit, and stood. At the door, she paused and looked back at him. "He is not what you think," she said. "He is searching for something, an answer to an old question. Be careful. You might be the one to give it to him." The door slid shut, and Kaelin was alone again. But the silence was different now. It was filled with the echo of her words, with the ghost of her sympathy, and with a terrifying, unwelcome flicker of something he had thought long dead. Hope. Rhys stood before the immense crystal steel window of his private observatory, the citadel sprawling beneath him like a glowing, geometric circuit board. The city was his creation, a monument to order, a fortress against the chaos that had consumed the world of his ancestors. Every light, every transport, every citizen moved in perfect, predictable harmony. It was a flawless system. It was a beautiful equation. And yet, tonight, for the first time in years, he felt a profound sense of dissonance. The flawless perfection of his city felt cold, empty. He closed his eyes, and against the blackness of his eyelids, he saw not the elegant lines of his citadel, but a chaotic waveform from a data slate. This is you. This is the shape of your defiance. The Omega Kaelin was a flaw in the equation, a variable he could not solve. Since their first encounter, something had shifted within him. It had started with the jolt of their touch, that brief, shocking plunge into the Omega's mind, a chaotic wilderness of fear and grief and a fierce, burning loyalty to faded memories. It was a landscape so alien to his own ordered consciousness that it had left him reeling. Now he was experiencing aftershocks, strange, intrusive sensations that did not belong to him. Earlier, while reviewing logistical reports on nutrient paste distribution, he had been struck by a sudden, vivid memory of the taste of sun-warmed berries, so real he could almost feel the juice on his tongue. He had never eaten a sun-warmed berry in his life. All Citadel food was synthesized for optimal nutrition. Later, as he'd walked the silent, sterile corridors toward his observatory, he had caught the scent of rain on dry earth, a phantom smell that had momentarily overwhelmed the recycled, purified air of the Citadel. These were not his memories. They were not his sensations. They were echoes, empathic residue bleeding from the Omega's mind into his own. It was a contamination, a violation of the sanctity of his own consciousness. His first instinct was to increase the psychic dampeners in the Omega's cell, to sever the fledgling connection, to sterilize the breach. But he hesitated. The scientist in him, the part that had driven him to capture the anomaly in the first place, was too curious. This empathic bleed was unprecedented. No sanctioned Omega had ever demonstrated the capacity for such a profound, uncontrolled psychic transference. Kaelin was not just a powerful empath, he was a broadcaster, and Rhys, for some reason he could not yet fathom, was the perfect receiver. He placed a hand against the cold surface of the window. The crystal was chilled from the thin upper atmosphere, a familiar, grounding sensation. But as his palm rested on the pane, a new feeling overlaid the cold, a ghost of warmth, the memory of a hand pressed against a sun-baked rock, the feeling of rough, warm stone under his fingertips. It was Kaelin's memory, so vivid and clear it was as if it were his own. He could feel the memory's emotional resonance, a sense of peace, of safety, of belonging to a world of natural warmth and texture. It was an emotion as foreign to Rhys as the sensation itself. His world was one of cool, smooth surfaces, of controlled temperatures, of logic and discipline. He had no memory of peace, only of the constant, crushing weight of responsibility. The weight of his father's legacy, the weight of his mother's failure. He pulled his hand back from the window as if burned, the phantom warmth vanishing, leaving only the familiar cold. The contamination was getting stronger. The Omega's inner world, his chaotic, emotional, organic world, was seeping into the cracks of Reese's carefully constructed reality. It was a threat. It was a danger to his control, to his focus, to the very foundation of his identity. And yet, he did not give the order to increase the dampeners. He stood in the silent observatory, surrounded by the perfect, sterile beauty of his creation, and felt the echo of a dead man's memory of the sun. He felt the ghost of a peace he had never known. The dissonance grew, a fracture line spreading through the smooth, cold surface of his soul. He had brought the chaos into his fortress, believing he could contain it, study it, and neutralize it. But he was beginning to suspect that he had made a grave miscalculation. You could not place a storm in a jar without the glass eventually beginning to crack. The Omega was not just a subject to be analyzed. He was a catalyst, a force of nature that threatened to shatter the perfect, silent, and profoundly lonely peace of Reese's world. For the first time, the Alpha King felt a flicker of an emotion he had not experienced since childhood. He felt a tremor of fear. Not for his city, not for his power, but for himself. He was the system, and the system was becoming unstable. Kalen lay on the pallet, his eyes closed, but he was not sleeping. He was retreating. He had discovered that if he concentrated, he could push past the sterile white walls of the cell and into the landscape of his own memories. It was a dangerous place, filled with ghosts and pain, but it was his. It was real. He walked the dusty paths of the settlement he had once called home. It wasn't in the undersector. It had been a hidden enclave on the blighted surface, a community of unsanctioned runaways living in the skeletal ruins of an old-world city. They were Omegas, Betas, even a few Alphas who had rejected the Citadel's rigid genetic caste system. They had called themselves the Free. He remembered the smell of wood smoke and roasting root vegetables, a scent of community and shared sustenance. He remembered Mara, the Alpha woman who had been their leader, her hands always covered in dirt from the hydroponic gardens, her laugh a deep, rumbling sound that made everyone feel safe. She had taught him how to read the sky, how to find clean water, how to be more than just his designation. "You are not an Omega, Kalen," she would say, her hand on his shoulder, a gesture of respect, not ownership. "You are a person. Your heart is your own. Don't ever let them tell you otherwise." He remembered Leo, a beta technician who could fix anything, from a broken water purifier to a child's toy. He had been the one to create Kalen's first crude inhibitor patches, working from salvaged Citadel schematics. "It's ugly, and it'll sting like hell," Leo had said, applying the first one to Kalen's neck with a gentle touch. "But it will keep you hidden. It will keep you safe." The chemical burn had been a small price to pay for the illusion of safety. And he remembered Anya, a young Omega girl with eyes the color of the summer sky, who had followed him everywhere. She had been the first person to not be afraid of his empathic sickness. When the waves of emotion from the others became too much, a cacophony of fear and worry that made his head spin, Anya would take his hand. Her own emotional signature was like a clear, calm pool of water, and her touch would soothe the storm in his mind. "It's not a sickness," she had whispered to him once, as they watched the twin moons rise over the ruins. "It's a gift. You feel everything. That's why you're so kind." He had been happy there. It was a hard life, a life of constant vigilance and scarcity, but it was a life filled with connection, with love. It was a life of color and scent and texture. It was everything the citadel was not. He allowed himself to sink into the memory of a summer afternoon, lying in a patch of resilient wild grass with Anya, watching the clouds drift in the hazy sky. He could feel the warmth of the sun on his skin, the tickle of the grass, the light pressure of Anya's head on his shoulder. It was a perfect moment of peace. And then the memory soured. The sky in his memory began to darken, the scent of grass replaced by the acrid smell of smoke. The peace was shattered by a sound he would never forget, the high-pitched, terrifying whine of citadel assault craft. The memory shifted, becoming a nightmare. Screams replaced laughter, the air filled with the sizzle of plasma fire and the smell of burning homes. He was running, his hand clasped tightly in Anya's, pulling her through the chaos. Mara was shouting, trying to rally a defense, a salvaged plasma rifle in her hands. He saw her fall, a look of shocked disbelief on her face. Leo pushed them towards an escape tunnel. "Go! Live!" he had yelled, before turning back to face the oncoming enforcers, a desperate, hopeless courage in his eyes. Kaylin and Anya had made it to the tunnel, scrambling into the darkness as their world burned behind them. They ran for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the bowels of the earth, following the old service conduits that eventually led to the undersector. But they were not safe. An enforcer patrol had cornered them in a narrow passage. Kaylin had tried to shield Anya, to put himself between her and the black armored figures. One of them had fired. The plasma bolt wasn't aimed at him. It struck the wall beside his head, and a shard of superheated metal had sheared off, slicing across his jaw. The pain was blinding, but it was nothing compared to the terror. He had stumbled back, and in that moment of distraction, they had grabbed Anya. He remembered her scream, her eyes wide with terror, her small hand reaching for him. And he had done the unforgivable. He had run. Consumed by pain and primal fear, he had turned and fled into the darkness, leaving her behind. The last thing he heard was her voice, screaming his name. The memory broke him. A raw, guttural sob tore from his throat, and he was back in the white cell, curled on the pallet, the phantom pain in his jaw a burning echo of his shame. The scar was not just a mark of violence. It was a brand of his cowardice, his failure. He was not the kind person Anya had believed him to be. He was a survivor, and survival had cost him everything. This was the memory he had fought to keep buried. This was the trauma that had shattered his control over his empathic abilities, turning a gentle sensitivity into a volatile, uncontrolled storm. Every flicker of fear he felt from others was a reminder of Anya's terror. Every pang of grief was an echo of his own loss. He had tried to build walls to keep it all out, but in the sterile silence of the cell, the walls had crumbled and the ghosts had come flooding in. He wept, not for his confinement, not for his fear, but for the girl he had left behind, for the home he had lost, and for the person he had been before he learned that survival could be a fate worse than death. The white walls of the cell seemed to watch him, silent, indifferent witnesses to his agony. They recorded his sobs, his elevated heart rate, his hormonal spike. It was all just more data. The shape of his grief. The door to the cell hissed open. Kalen didn't look up, didn't even react. He remained curled on the pallet, a wreck of a man, adrift in a sea of memory and shame. He heard the soft, measured footsteps approach and stop beside him. He expected a prod, a command, an injection. Instead, there was only silence. He could feel Reese's presence, a column of cold, disciplined power. He braced himself for the clinical analysis, the detached commentary on his emotional breakdown. "The settlement in the Azure Canyons," Reese said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual cold authority. It was almost hesitant. It was designated Hostile Encampment 7. The official report cited armed insurrection against Citadel authority and illegal genetic propagation. Kalen froze. How could he know? He had not spoken of it. He had not written of it. He had only remembered it. The empathic bleed. Reese had not just felt his phantom sensations. He had seen his memories. The thought was a profound violation, a psychic intrusion so deep it made his skin crawl. He slowly pushed himself up, turning to face the sovereign. His face was tear-streaked, his eyes burning with a fresh wave of hatred. "You saw," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You were in my head." Reese did not deny it. He looked unsettled. The perfect, icy composure was gone, replaced by something complex and deeply disturbed. His grey eyes were clouded. "It was not intentional," Reese said, his voice tight. "Your emotional resonance, it is overwhelming. It imprinted on my consciousness." He looked away from Kalen, his gaze fixed on the seamless white wall as if he were seeing something else entirely. "I saw the fire," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I felt the heat." The admission hung in the air between them, a shocking confession of vulnerability from a man who was supposed to be invulnerable. The architect of the system, the embodiment of pure logic, had been touched by the chaotic, messy, painful world of Kalen's past. He had felt Kalen's loss. Kalen stared at him, his hatred momentarily eclipsed by a stunned disbelief. The man who had ordered the destruction of his home, who had orphaned and scarred him, was now standing in his cell, haunted by the ghosts of his own creation. The irony was so bitter it was almost laughable. "Why?" Kalen demanded, his voice gaining strength. "Why did you do it? We were not a threat. We were just living." Reese turned back to face him, and for the first time, Kalen saw not a king or a scientist, but a man burdened by a weight Kalen could not comprehend. The cold mask was back in place, but it was thinner now, more brittle. "Unsanctioned propagation leads to genetic degradation. Uncontrolled empathic and telepathic abilities lead to psychic contagion, social collapse, and mass hysteria," Reese recited, the words sounding like a catechism he had repeated 1,000 times. "Order must be maintained. Stability is paramount." "That's not an answer," Kalen shot back, getting to his feet, his fists clenched. "That's propaganda. That's an excuse." "It is not an excuse." Reese's voice cracked like a whip, the sudden surge of emotion so unexpected it made Kalen take a step back. The air in the cell grew heavy, charged with the sovereign's powerful alpha pheromones, a scent of ozone and gathering storm. "It is a lesson written in blood and fire." Reese's composure shattered. He strode across the small cell, his movements agitated, his disciplined control finally breaking. He looked trapped, a predator in a cage of his own making. "You think you are the only one who has lost everything to this contagion," he snarled, his voice thick with a long-suppressed pain. He stopped in front of Kalen, his grey eyes blazing with a cold fire. My mother was an Omega, not a sanctioned, docile creature like the ones we breed now. She was like you, powerful, uncontrolled, an empath of unparalleled strength. He spoke the words as if they were a curse. She was the sovereign's consort, loved by my father, the people. They called her the heart of the citadel. She believed, as you do, that emotion was a gift, not a sickness. That connection was strength. He let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. And then came the solar flare contagion, a wave of cosmic radiation that amplified latent psychic abilities across the planet. For most, it was headaches, nightmares. For my mother, it was a tidal wave. She felt the fear and pain of 1 billion souls all at once. Her mind, her gift, became a psychic amplifier. She couldn't control it. She broadcast that wave of terror across the entire citadel. He paused, his jaw tight, his gaze distant, lost in a memory Kaelin could now almost feel. A cold, terrifying echo. The heart of the citadel became its plague. Her broadcast of pure, undiluted terror drove 1 million people insane. Riots, suicides, mass murder. My father, an alpha of immense strength, tried to reach her, to shield her, to calm the storm. But her psychic scream, it shattered his mind before he could even get close. I was a child. I watched from a shielded room as the mother who had sung me to sleep became a monster that tore our world apart. I watched as my father died trying to save her. He fell silent. The raw, ugly truth of his past laid bare in the sterile white room. His entire philosophy, his obsession with control, his cold, sterile world. It was all a tombstone, a monument to the family he had lost, built on the foundations of his own trauma. He had not destroyed Kaelin's world out of malice. He had done it out of fear, a deep, abiding terror that history would repeat itself. He looked at Kaelin, his eyes filled with a terrible, ancient pain. I am not creating a prison, Subject 734, he said, his voice ragged. I am trying to prevent an apocalypse. I study you. I test you, because I have to know if there is another way, if the storm can be calmed, or if it must always be caged. The revelation was a physical blow. Kaelin's hatred, the fuel that had kept him going, sputtered and died, replaced by a dizzying, complicated wave of understanding. He was not looking at his jailer. He was looking at a mirror. Another soul scarred and shaped by a fire he did not start. The citadel shuddered. It was not a violent shake, but a deep, low-frequency vibration that hummed up through the floor, a groan from the very bones of the city. A moment later, a siren began to wail, a sound Kaelin had never heard before. It was not a sharp, aggressive alarm, but a rising, dissonant chord that seemed designed to grate on the nerves, to instill a sense of deep, systemic wrongness. The perfect white light in his cell flickered, dimmed, and then shifted to a sickly, pulsing red. Rhys, who had been standing frozen in the wake of his confession, straightened instantly. The haunted man was gone, replaced in a heartbeat by the sovereign. His face was a mask of cold focus, his eyes darting towards the door as he accessed his internal comm system, a link Kaelin could not hear but could feel as a sudden tightening of the psychic atmosphere. "Report," Rhys commanded, his voice low and sharp, directed at the air itself. There was a pause. Kaelin watched him, his own fear a cold knot in his stomach. The alarm felt alive. It vibrated with a note of panic that resonated with his own empathic senses. Something was terribly wrong. Rhys's jaw tightened. All sectors, What's the source? Another pause. The atmospheric processors? Impossible. They have quintuple redundancy. He listened again, his expression growing grimmer. Psychic feedback loop. Explain. Kalen could feel it now, a faint but growing wave of distress bleeding through the walls, through the psychic dampeners of the facility. It was the low, persistent hum of anxiety from a million souls, a city-wide panic attack just beginning to build. It felt like the pressure in the air before a massive storm. Rhys turned his gaze on Kalen, and his eyes were like chips of ice. "It seems your theory is about to be tested, subject," he said, his voice devoid of any of the emotion he had shown moments before. The door slid open, and Ilara stood there, her face pale, her professional composure strained. She held a data slate, her hands trembling slightly. "Sovereign," she said, her voice tight. "It's a cascading failure, a solar anomaly, similar to the one from 70 cycles ago, has disrupted the primary regulators on the atmospheric processes. The filtration system is introducing a low-level neurotoxin into the air supply." "Symptoms?" Rhys demanded, already moving towards the door. "Irritability, paranoia, heightened emotional states," Ilara reported, falling into step beside him. "For most of the populace, it's manageable, but for anyone with latent psychic sensitivity, it's amplifying their emotional responses. And the processor's control network is psychic. The fear of the operators is creating a feedback loop, destabilizing the system further with every passing second. The entire city's emotional state is spiraling. We're projecting total system collapse within the hour." Rhys stopped, his back to Kalen. The pulsing red light cast his shadow, long and menacing, across the floor. He was facing an echo of his own worst nightmare. A city on the brink of madness, brought down by a wave of psychic contagion. His methods, his systems of control, were failing. "Standard protocols," he ordered. "Flood the affected systems with psychic dampeners. Isolate the operators. Sedate the populace through the ventilation system if you have to." "We've tried, Sovereign," Ilara said, her voice strained with desperation. "The dampeners are being overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the emotional broadcast, and the sedative will take too long to synthesize and distribute. The system is all accelerating towards chaos too quickly. It's like your mother's contagion, but slower, more insidious." The name hung in the air, a curse and a prophecy. Rhys stood motionless for a long moment, the weight of a million lives, the weight of his own history pressing down on him. Kalen could feel the Sovereign's conflict, a maelstrom of cold logic and rising panic warring within him. He was a man trapped between his past and a terrifying future. He could feel Rhys running through every protocol, every contingency, and finding them all wanting. His system, his perfect equation of order, had no solution for this problem. And then, slowly, Rhys turned. He looked at Kalen, and his gaze was no longer that of a scientist looking at a specimen, or a king looking at a prisoner. It was the look of a man who had run out of options, a man staring into the abyss and finding only one, terrifying, uncertain path forward. "You," Rhys said, his voice flat, but underneath it, Kalen could feel a tremor of something he never thought he would sense from the Alpha King. Desperation. "Your empathic field. You said it was a storm." "What about it?" Kalen asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. "A storm can be a destructive force," Rhys said, his eyes boring into Kalen's, a strange, intense light in their grey depths. "But it can also absorb other energies. It can create a center of calm, a focal point. He was not making sense. He was talking in metaphors, his logical mind grappling with a concept that defied his understanding. "What are you asking?" Kaelin breathed. Elara looked between them, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. "Sovereign, you can't be considering this," she whispered. "His abilities are volatile, uncontrolled. The feedback could kill him, or turn him into an amplifier, just like—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Rhys ignored her. His entire focus was on Kaelin. "I am asking," Rhys said slowly, deliberately, "if you can calm a storm. Not with cages, not with dampeners, but with a stronger storm." He was asking Kaelin to do the impossible, to face the rising tide of a city's panic and not be drowned by it, to become a psychic lightning rod, to draw all the fear and chaos into himself. It was a suicide mission, a death sentence. But as Kaelin looked at the man who had been his tormentor, he saw the ghost of a terrified child watching his world burn. He saw the reflection of his own pain. And in that moment, he understood what Elara had meant. He was the answer to Rhys's old question. "You'll have to take these off," Kaelin said, his voice surprisingly steady as he held up his hands, indicating the phantom weight of the chains he had worn, the confinement that still bound him. It was not a question. It was a condition, a demand for trust from a man who had given him none. For a long moment, Rhys just stared at him. The sirens wailed. The citadel groaned around them. Then, with a curt, decisive nod, the Gaham sovereign agreed. Done. The heart of the citadel was not a throne room or a command center, but a vast, spherical chamber known as the Nexus. At its center, suspended in a web of shimmering energy conduits, was a flawless, crystalline sphere, 10 meters in diameter, the primary processing core for the entire city. It pulsed with a soft, inner light, a rhythm that was usually as steady and calm as a sleeping god's breath. Now, it was erratic. The light within flickered violently, shifting from cool blue to a jarring, angry red, mirroring the pulsing emergency lights of the chamber. The air hummed with a dissonant energy, a psychic static that felt like nails scraping against the inside of Kaelin's skull. The collective panic of the city was being focused here, amplified, and broadcast back out through the system, creating the feedback loop that was tearing the citadel apart. Rhys led the way, his long black coat swirling around him, Elara a half-step behind, her face a mask of grim determination. Kaelin followed, his bare feet cold on the polished floor. He was unbound. No chains, no guards, no dampening field. The sudden absence of restraint was as disorienting as its presence had been. He felt raw, exposed, every flicker of fear from the technicians lining the chamber's perimeter, every spike of anxiety from the city beyond, washed over him in dizzying waves. He had to fight to stay upright, to keep his own rising panic from being swept away by the tidal wave of others. "It's worse than the projections indicated," Rhys said, his voice tight as he studied the crystalline core. "The feedback is nearing a resonant frequency. If it reaches it, the core will shatter. The psychic backlash will not just cause madness, it will be lethal. A wave of pure psychic energy that will boil the synapses of every living thing in this city." He turned to Kaelin, his face pale in the blood-red light. The sovereign, the man of absolute control, looked for the first time like he was not in command of the situation. "What do you need?" he asked. The question, a plea for instruction from a man who only ever gave orders, was staggering. Kaelin looked at the chaotic, pulsing heart of the city. He could feel its pain. its fear. It was like a living creature screaming in agony. I don't know, he admitted, his voice trembling. I've only ever tried to block it out, to build walls. I don't know how to open myself up to it. He felt a wave of despair. They were all going to die, and it was because he was too broken, too afraid. You are not alone in this, Rhys said, his voice regaining a sliver of its old authority. But it was different now. It was not the command of a king, but the reassurance of something else. He stepped closer to Kaelin, into his personal space. The scent of ozone and cold stone was a grounding force in the swirling chaos of the room. The legends of the first alphas and omegas, they were not just about breeding. They spoke of a balance, a psychic symbiosis, the alpha as the anchor, the omega as the conduit. He was talking about a bond, a connection so deep it was mythical, a thing of poetry and propaganda used to justify the pairing system. Kaelin had always believed it was a lie. That's not real, Kaelin choked out, as another wave of civic terror washed over him. It's a story. Today, we will discover the truth, Rhys said. He reached out, not to grab or restrain, but with his palm open, an invitation. I will be your anchor. I will shield you from the worst of it. But you must be the conduit. You must open the floodgates and let the storm flow through you. Can you do that? Kaelin looked from Rhys's outstretched hand to the dying heart of the city. He thought of Anya, of Mara, of the home he had lost to a fire started by this man's fear. But he also saw the terrified child in Rhys's eyes, the man who was just as haunted, just as broken as he was. This was not about forgiveness. It was about breaking a cycle. It was about choosing a different ending to the same old story. He took a deep breath and placed his trembling hand in Rhys's. The moment their skin touched, the world exploded. It was 1,000 times more intense than the first jolt in the throne room. Kaelin's consciousness was ripped from his body, flung into a maelstrom of pure, raw emotion. He felt the panic of a million strangers, a suffocating, crushing weight. He was drowning. He screamed, a raw, soundless cry of the soul. Anchor yourself to me, Kaelin. The voice was not a sound, but a thought, a pillar of pure, cold will in the center of the hurricane. It was Rhys. Kaelin latched onto it, a drowning man clinging to a rock. He focused on the feeling of Rhys's hand, the cold, steady presence in the chaos. And through that link, he felt Rhys. He felt the crushing weight of the sovereign's loneliness, the vast, silent emptiness of his soul. He felt the ironclad discipline, the rigid control that was both his strength and his prison. And beneath it all, he felt the deep, unhealed wound of a child's grief. At the same time, Rhys gasped, his knees buckling for a moment. He was feeling Kaelin's entire life, the sun-warmed grass, the taste of real bread, Mara's laugh, Leo's kindness, Anya's trusting hand. And then, the fire, the loss, the guilt, the shame. He felt the agony of Kaelin's scar as if it were his own. For a moment, their identities blurred. They were two broken halves of a single damaged soul, seeing the world through each other's eyes. Focus, Rhys projected, his own control strained to the breaking point by the flood of Kaelin's pain. The core. You are the conduit. I am the shield. Let it flow. Kaelin understood. He stopped fighting the storm of the city's fear. He stopped trying to build walls. With Rhys as his anchor, he opened himself completely. He became a hollow vessel. And the terror of the city, the red, screaming chaos of the Nexus, rushed into him. It was an agony beyond description, Every fear, every nightmare, every pang of anxiety from 1,000,000 souls flooded his senses. But it did not destroy him, because, as it flowed into him, it also flowed through him, across the bridge of their joined hands, and into Rhys. Rhys took the full, raw force of it. His body went rigid, a low groan of agony escaping his lips. He was not nullifying the emotion. He was containing it, wrestling it into submission with his own immense, disciplined will. He was taking the chaotic energy and grounding it, bleeding it off into the cold, empty spaces of his own soul. He was turning Kaelin's pain and the city's pain into his own. Kaelin, freed from the fear of drowning, could finally act. He was no longer just a vessel. He was a director. He reached out with his mind, not to the fear, but to what lay beneath it: the shared humanity, the desire for safety, the love for family, the simple, desperate will to live. He found these threads, these faint, golden strands of hope in the sea of red terror, and he began to weave them together. He broadcast not a command, but an offering, a feeling of calm, the memory of the sun on his face, the sound of Mara's reassuring laugh, the feeling of Anya's hand in his. He sent it out, a quiet, gentle wave of peace that pushed against the tide of fear. The crystalline core in the center of the chamber flickered. The violent red began to recede, softened by threads of warm, golden light. The dissonant hum lessened, the psychic static clearing. In the city above, 1,000,000 people simultaneously took a deep breath, a collective sigh of relief for a reason they could not name. The panic began to ebb. The storm was breaking. Kaelin poured everything he was into, that final wave of calm, all his pain, all his love, all his hope for a world that was not built on fear. And then his strength gave out. The world went black, and he fell, his hand slipping from Rhys's into a quiet, welcoming darkness. The silence that woke him was different. It was not the sterile, oppressive silence of the cell, nor the tense, charged silence of the nexus before the storm broke. It was a gentle, peaceful quiet, like the calm after a long rain. He was in a bed, a real bed, with soft linens that smelled faintly of lavender and cedar. The light was dim, filtering through a high window, painting a soft golden rectangle on the opposite wall. The room was spacious, furnished with a simple elegance: dark wood, muted fabrics, a distinct lack of sterile white polymers. It felt personal, lived in. He pushed himself up, his body aching as if he'd run a marathon, but his mind was clear. The constant, low-level hum of civic anxiety that had been the background noise of his entire life was gone. The psychic atmosphere of the citadel was calm. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. He was wearing a soft, dark blue tunic, not the grey uniform of a prisoner. He looked around the room. On a table, near the window, sat a single, perfect white orchid in a simple black vase. It was Rhys's room. He was in the sovereign's private quarters. The door opened, and Rhys entered. He looked changed. He wore a simple black tunic, no different from his usual attire, but the rigid, regal posture was gone. He seemed tired, worn, but the coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, resonant stillness. He carried a tray with a glass of water and a small bowl of something that was not nutrient paste. It was sliced fruit, red and gold, glistening with juice. Rhys placed the tray on the table beside the bed. He did not speak for a long moment, his gaze on Kaelin, a complex, unreadable expression on his face. "The core is stable," he said finally, his voice quiet. The city is calm. Elara is calling it the Great Silence. A miracle. What happened? Kalen asked, his own voice raspy. You saved us, Reese said simply. There was no embellishment, no analysis, just a statement of fact. You took the fear of 1 million people and transformed it. You showed them peace. He paused, his gaze turning inward. You showed me peace. The admission was profound. He had seen inside Kalen, and Kalen had seen inside him. They had shared a lifetime of pain and loss in the space of a few heartbeats. The chasm between prisoner and king had been erased, filled in with the common ground of their shared trauma, and a connection that defied logic. The system I built, it was based on a flawed premise, Reese continued, his voice low, measured, but laced with a new humility. I believed emotion was a contagion to be sterilized, a chaos to be caged. I built walls to keep it out, but I was wrong. The flaw was not in the emotion, but in the isolation. My mother, she faced the storm alone. We faced it together. He looked at Kalen, and for the first time, his eyes held no trace of the scientist or the sovereign. There was only a man, stripped bare of his ideology, his defenses. I saw your life, Kalen. I felt your losses as my own. I cannot erase what I have done, the pain my system has caused, the destruction of your home. It was an act born of fear. My fear. I saw yours too, Kalen said softly. He thought of the little boy watching his world shatter. The fear of a child who lost everything. An understanding passed between them, silent and complete. It was not forgiveness, not yet. It was something more fragile, more profound. It was recognition. Reese picked up a slice of fruit and offered it to Kalen. It was a simple gesture, but it was freighted with meaning. It was an offering of sustenance, of care, an act of peace. Kalen took it, his fingers brushing against Reese's. The brief contact sent a soft, warm echo of their connection through him, a gentle hum where before there had been a violent storm. He bit into the fruit. The taste was sweet, vibrant, real. It was the taste of a life he had thought was lost to him forever. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, the only sound the soft morning light filling the room. The citadel was quiet. The ghosts were quiet. What happens now? Kalen asked, breaking the silence. The system is broken. You can't go back to the way things were. No, Reese agreed. We cannot. He stood and walked to the vast window, looking out over the city he had built and had almost lost. It was the same view as from the observatory, the same perfect geometric layout. But the light was different now. It felt warmer, softer. The old equation was wrong, Reese said. Order at the cost of humanity is not order. It is a cage. We need a new equation, one that includes variables I did not account for. He turned back from the window, his gaze meeting Kalen's across the room. I spent my life trying to control a storm. Perhaps it is time to learn how to live with it, to listen to it. He was no longer speaking about the city. He was speaking about Kalen. He was speaking about himself. The future was a vast, terrifying, unknown. Rebuilding a society, healing a lifetime of trauma, it was a task that seemed impossible. But as Kalen looked at the Alpha King, the man who had ordered his capture, the man who had whispered, "You're mine," in chains, he no longer saw an antagonist. He saw a partner, an anchor. He was no longer a prisoner. He was the other half of a new, untested, and terrifyingly hopeful equation. The chains were gone, but a new bond had been forged in the heart of the storm. A bond not of ownership, but of balance. and for the first time in a very long time, Kalen did not feel the need to run. He felt like he was finally home.